Hi, folks. So this is a lecture about neutral theory. You should have previously watched my screencast lecture about neutral theory and classical niche theory to try to make sure you have the background for this one, because I'm going to move through pretty quickly. Primarily, the goal here is to give you some evidence-based approaches and an approach that sort of parallels that of your textbook. So the first part of this talk is talking about how Hubble came up with the neutral theory ideas and the sort of data that supported it. And the second part is just going to be some other evidence, both that supports it and refutes it. And I think it's important to recognize that neutral theory can be important, but not in all places and all times. We'll talk a little bit about how that works exactly. And I think you should be able to say, yeah, neutral theory under these conditions is really important, or these parts of the Amazon. But in other areas, it appears that other processes are governing the composition of trees. So let's get started. So this PowerPoint is basically, zip, two basic questions. What mechanisms promote the coexistence of large numbers of tree species in the tropics, particularly in the Amazon basin? And what mechanisms promoted the evolution of so many trees in the tropics? So we're not going to deal with the evolutionary one today. That's at the bottom. We're going to deal with the top one, promote the coexistence, right? So from ecological terms, we're not talking about speciation right now. We're just talking about why don't species go extinct due to competitive exclusion? Because it appears so many, I'll be brief here, there are so many different species. It doesn't seem possible that everyone could occupy its own niche. So if that's not the case, they don't occupy their own niches, then why doesn't some of them drive the others to extinction? And that's what an explanation for that Hubble proposed. We're interested in gaps because gaps in the forest where trees fall down create these light regimes where there's a lot of light on the forest floor. We're also interested in this concept of equilibrium, and that is the composition of the rainforest something that if we disturb it, does it return to that structure, or is it something that once disturbed will continue along the new disturbed path? We know that light is limiting, particularly in the understory. We know that some tree species specialize to different light levels. And if that's the case, some authors have proposed that light levels provide unique niches for trees to specialize in, thereby reducing competitive exclusion. We might consider, is each tree species adapted to particular combinations of environmental conditions, or is it that trees just grow haphazardly in the forest, a process determined by random events? We might ask, is there such thing as climax forests as we go through the successionary process? Or are the forests constantly in a state of change? We know that succession occurs in a lot of terrestrial habitats we're familiar with. We know that even here in Grand Junction, we see that in the high country that after a forest fire, you might have shrubs come back, and then you might have aspen trees come back. And then after the aspen trees are there, they make some shade, and the spruce and fir shade them out. And then they result in that climax composition of forest, which is the spruce fir climax forest. Then it wouldn't change essentially until some form of disturbance. On the left here, you see a gap. On the right, you see a forest. You can see one is dark, one is light. They're very different structure. The gaps you see from these images, you can pause and look at this. Basically, the gaps are hot. And the forest is cool, and a clearing is very similar, very hot and very cool under the forest. Oops. So it has been proposed, and it was very popular back in the 90s, this idea of gap phase regeneration, which meant that if we treated small tree fall gaps as mini successional areas, then we would see that some species of trees would occupy those that were the pioneer guilds. And then as succession occurred in that gap, it would change from a group of pioneers to mid-succession to climax forest, and that each of those stages would be associated with different composition of trees. That would mean that the tree composition in gaps would be different than the tree composition in a forest because they'd be gap specialists. And this was a pretty good idea, and a lot of people supported it. And in fact, Hubble and Foster wrote a chapter in conservation biology textbook in the 1990s, early 90s, and gave some really good data to support this. And the data looks like this. If you look at the graphs, the black lines represent the amount of forest that was sampled of each height class. So short forests are those that are gaps, tall forests are climax forests. And you can see they sampled more climax forests than gaps, right? The white bars represent the actual number of saplings found for each of these different species. And what you see is that Cecropia, the first upper left, has a lot more saplings than expected in the gaps. And Cecropia is well known as a sort of flagship tree for this idea of there being highlight specialists in gaps, a pioneer species, fast growing. And if you look at below that, you see a tree by Schmeidia. Pendula has just about a random distribution of the forest, that pretty much the trees are found proportional to how much is sampled. So it doesn't really care. Upper right-hand corner, Alcornia is clearly a mid-level forest specialist. It is more common to find saplings of Alcornia in a mid-level forest. And at the bottom, we see Nectandra, which is an older growth specialist, which grows in the shade of taller trees. And so you see lots more of it there in the right-hand side in tall trees. So this sort of data basically reached out and told people, look, we are searching to find how each of the trees in the rainforest fits into a different light niche. And here are some examples of case studies. And get ready, we are going to figure out where every tree in the rainforest belongs. And so they started doing this. And they formalized this as that hypothesis to explain local disturbances like gaps promote the coexistence of species having different resource use strategies and dispersal and competitive abilities. And they use this process called gap phase regeneration, which is the mini successional sequence, which culminates in the replacement of original canopy by one or more new trees. So a research done by Kobe was a nice sort of lab experiment to show, gosh, do some trees really like more light than other trees? And what they found was this kind of messy graph, but there's 4 major lines moving across here. And those lines show that for these 2 dashed lines at the bottom, what we see is a reduction in mortality as we increase light levels all the way up pretty much to full light. So for those 2 species, Castilla and Trophis, we see more light is better light. For the other species that are in the study, what we see is that light is better, makes for better living all the way up until about 20% light. And then it starts to get not so good again because there's too much light. And that is the case for this Peruma species, genus, and this Cecropia species pretty much increases, gets better and better and better until it reaches 20% light. And then it levels off. Surprising for Cecropia, which is, of course, I just mentioned, is heralded as one of the gap specialists. So what that meant, I suppose I should summarize that, it says here at the bottom, is that all 4 species tested actually did have lower mortality at higher light levels up to about 20%. And keep in mind, the forest floor understory is going to be less than 1%. So any kind of a gap is going to improve life for most of these trees, at least of these 4. But above 20%, there might be some mixed differences there. So some trees really are going to struggle with too much light. I'm going to skip the previous slide there. Foster et al., which included Hubble and Foster, and was this landmark paper on the maintenance of tropical diversity. They basically came out and said, gosh, maybe everything we've said about niche is wrong. I love this part of science. So the cool thing here is that, you have to accept data for what it is, and it tells you what's really happening. And what I think happened, at least my interpretation of, watching all this come out in the literature, is that Hubble was studying these trees and he was looking for these niches. And he had these massive studies. So this kind of a massive study here, basically a 50-hectare plot, which is 50 hectares. That's 100 football fields, right? It's big. They looked at all the woody plants greater than 1 centimeter in height, diameter at breast height, which is, so here at the chest height, is it 1 centimeter in diameter? If it is, count it. And they looked at these things for 15 or 20 years, which is like 20,000 trees. It's a tremendous amount of information. And they classified them as gap species, shade tolerant species, intermediate species, and they're really preparing to sort of unlock the niche specialization of all these tropical trees. And what they found, they had all these gaps in there as well, right? So that helping them look at these light regimes and the contribution of the light regimes. More data here that isn't all that important. Species richness, what they found, first of all, they found a lot more species in gaps. And they were like, yeah, the gap, that's the origin of species richness. And then they were like, wait a minute, there's a problem. And spurious here, there's a spurious result, which means a misleading or false result, because there were more individuals in the gap. So what ended up happening is, if you look at this graph, what ends up happening here is, I can't, sapling species per quadrant is on the top graph, and I don't think really many of the axes matter. What matters, the two lines are different there. And what was happening is that, if you remember that 2 halves, negative 2 halves, 3 halves thinning rule that we looked at earlier in class, that when succession begins, you have a lot of small individuals, and then they all compete and fight it out, and at the end there's a few large individuals. It turns out there's more individuals in a gap. Like, if you're counting tiny trees that are only 1 or 2 centimeters in diameter, you're going to have a lot of in a gap, like hundreds, maybe even thousands. But in the mature forest, you only have a few trees in the same amount of area. As a result, they were spurious results that showed them lots of species richness in the gap, but it was largely due to there being more individuals. Had they scaled the number of species for the number of individuals, they would have found there was just a lot more individuals, and the number of species per individual actually is the same as you find in the forest. And that's what's shown here in plot B. And that is that gaps and tropical and mature forests were the same species richness if you just counted, like, basically the number of species based on the number of stems sampled. So that means that a gap is really just a random subset of the forest around it. And that is, I think, like the first profound thing that must have hit Hubble, must have. I don't know how he discovered these things, but I imagine that happening and going, whoa, because I read these things in literature and I was like, wait a minute, if a gap is just a random subsample of the area around it, then there's nothing special about a gap, except there's more individuals in it, not more species. There are more species, but that's because there's more individuals. When it matures, there won't be more species. Okay. So those individuals are not a special kind of individual. They're not special gap things. They're just a random selection of the forest around it. That's interesting. Okay, let's move on. The next thing that he found is, if he looked over time, and the graph that's important here is the one that is on your left. I think that's your left. And the relative species abundance. So this is basically the frequency of each species in the forest, and then across years. And the question would be, if you started out with a lot of gaps, and those gaps then matured over time, you would expect that succession to occur where the pioneer species dropped out and the climax species grew in. Alternatively, if you had gaps being created, what you would see is that gap species, the climax species, would decline, and you would see an increase in pioneer species. As you can see, there are straight lines moving across this graph. That means nothing is changing over time. The frequency of each species is staying the same. And Hubble must have just been floored by this. I would have expected to see pretty big changes in the frequency of some trees whose habitat type was, going up or going down, whose light levels were increasing or decreasing. So I think that's phenomenal. And so that is really the big piece of data. And what they also found, that diversity itself, the number of species, really didn't change based on the number of canopy height changes. So more gap creation didn't make more species. It just made more individuals of the same species that were in the forest around it. That's a weird thought. So when you think about this, as you're like, oh, well, I guess there's nothing special about gaps, except they're just a random subsample of the forest around them. And this, I would imagine, looking at this data, must have been how Hubble must have started this process of, I've got to come up with another explanation for tropical tree diversity, because this whole niche thing is not working out. So we see the pioneer richness, I mentioned that, doesn't increase with gap size. What we do find from out there is this idea that recruitment limitation is important. Now, that is the failure of a species to recruit in all sites, meaning to grow new individuals in all sites, favorable for its growth and survival. So if you look at this little image of a tree here, what you're seeing is it's, basically all the seeds fall close to the parent. And organisms like plants are having a hard time getting anywhere to get all around the forest to get to all these potential places. So essentially, if what's happening out there is that trees are sort of everywhere and these gaps are created fairly randomly in the forest, then to grow in a gap, you have to have seed there when the gap grows. Getting a seed there might not be that easy because all species don't have all their seeds, or all species don't have seeds in all places all the time. So the other thing that we look at here is that, when these seeds grow up, do they actually have a competitive advantage that's predictable over some other species? Like in a gap, is Cecropia better than Paruma? Well, it turns out that what Hubble did was looked at this massive data set and looked at all these seedlings growing up and looked at their fates. And he looked at all their 6 nearest neighbors and tried to figure out from those neighbor pairings and these thousands of seedlings, which of them were consistent winners over the others. And he couldn't find a pattern. Like the nearest neighbor was not predictable. Like you couldn't predict if species A was next to species M, if species A would always win or species M would always win. It wasn't predictable. And what was predictable was that the height of a seedling at the time the gap was created was the best predictor of whether or not that seedling would survive to adulthood, or at least to compete with the neighbors. Now you think about that. How do you get to be an old seedling at that time? And so this pretty much leaves us with a whole lot of random processes, like getting a seed somewhere, and germinating and not getting eaten, and then growing and surviving through all the other things. And then when the tree gap comes, boom, it's totally destructive and all this tree comes down, and then you don't get crushed. And then you're the tallest seedling at the time the gap was created. So I think that's a great series of random events that is governing that. One of the things that is also here is the potential for to actually be able to reach a space and then grow in that space and then be the tallest seedling. That process of dispersal, growth, and height, and combination of the fall is what we call a stochastic process. Lots of random events. There probably is no genetic predisposition that could be selected for by natural selection to allow a species to be the supreme competitor in that situation. At least that's what it looks like. So if you look at seed traps, which is one of the things they did in this research, they found that, which is basically catching seeds in a square meter of the rainforest and seeing what lands there, that there were 260 species they looked at. There were 10,000 seeds or 100,000 seeds, actually. Most of the species, like 88% of the species, failed to deliver one seed to any given trap. And what that means is that if you turn that around, I suppose that a trap is catching on average about 12% of the species. So basically any one spot in the rainforest where you're hoping to plan where things are going to grow, who's going to grow up when there's a gap created, you're not even getting but a small portion of the rainforest around there is even getting to that site. That means that not everyone who could grow there has a chance. What I mean by everyone, I mean not every species. So the conclusions from this are then that the relatively mild gap disturbance regime on Barrow, Colorado Island is largely decoupled by recruitment limitation from controlling variation at the local tree diversity. So what that means is recruitment limitation, the inability to get seeds where they could be, really prevents these gap disturbance regimes from being important as niches for trees. There is virtually no gap-to-gap predictability of the species richness in gaps or of the composition of any regeneration niche guild, including pioneers, due to strong recruitment limitation. Okay, The search for a strong and predictable relationship between gap disturbance and regimes and tree species richness in tropical forests will prove fruitless. Haha, funny joke. But the idea is that even though this great process of niche partitioning and competition and species having these different temporal and light gap spaces is a great plan, in reality, it just doesn't work out that way. That because seeds don't get everywhere, they can't be where they ought to be. So recruitment limitation turns out to be this key evidence-based piece that says seeds don't get everywhere, so it's not possible for a tree to grow and dominate a particular niche. Some more data out here about the gap sizes. Basically, I'm going to rephrase some of this in the terms of the textbook reading and think about an equilibrium versus a non-equilibrium model. In Hubble's non-equilibrium model, which is what this neutral model is, because it doesn't lead to a particular composition of trees, it is simply a composition that is there, that is perpetuating through time as a result of random forces. That means the common things that are out there will stay common and the rare things will stay pretty rare, and they'll drift through ecological time in their frequency. So all species lack density dependence and are by implication adaptively equivalent, which is, basically ecological hearsay, but it appears to be functionally true. The model specifies that the composition of a tropical tree community is subject to random errors of sampling so that it drifts through time at a rate inversely proportional to the size of the population under consideration. Now, this is the same language we have seen for neutral theory that applies to genetics. Genetic drift is exactly the same definition. Rare things tend to be more variable because sampling variances has a larger effect on them, just like demographic stochasticity. And what we see is that common things are more closely aligned to the expected value in the number of seeds times the probability of survival that we expect to happen in each generation. Another way of looking at this is to say the critical distinction between equilibrium and non-equilibrium communities, to our way of thinking, is whether a particular species assemblage is stabilized by intrinsic biotic interactions under the given environmental regime of the site, and whether if the species mixture is altered, the community tends to return to its former composition. That would be equilibrium when it returns, but it doesn't look like anything's going to return. Now, what we do know about rainforest is it takes a long time for these trees to reach a mature state, so we can expect to see succession occurring very slowly. And so another piece of work was done by Terborg on the forests of Peru. Let's take a look at that next. So basically these rivers meander in these big S curves across the flats of the Amazon, and they tend to meander in a single direction, like to the north or to the south, for example. And what we see is on the outside banks, nice old forest is cut away. And on the inside bank, the inside of an S curve, what you would have is a long sandbar that grows and grows and grows out towards the end. And eventually the trees along that peninsula, of course, the ones at the very tip where the river is depositing new sand are going to be the young group. And then as you move back down the peninsula towards the base there, what you have is older trees that have been growing for a much longer time. So he tried to make some predictions, and here's the shape of the river there. And you can see that these should be older forests out here, and inside the peninsula here should be younger forests. Same thing here. This should all be young forests, older forests back here. And this is set over like 20 or 30 miles of river. And he looked at the composition of the forest and he said, let's see if we can have predictable forest types by distance from the river, and then repeat the sampling up and down this river so we have samples that are a long way away from each other. And what he found, and I guess I don't have it written on here exactly, what he found was that, holy smoke, these things are really predictable. Young forests have the same composition, medium forests have the same composition, old forests have the same composition. So an old forest that was several hundred years old was going to be more similar to an old forest 20 miles away than it was to a young forest that was a few hundred feet away. Bam! Looks like we have niche theory coming back to haunt us, and it's solid. And what would Hubble say to this? And I would say it is possible for both of these things to coexist as facts and be true, right? And the way this is done is that Hubble basically constrains his neutral theory to be all in one habitat type. so that when you have a homogeneous habitat type, where all the trees in there are in the same habitat, I'm repeating myself, same habitat type, and all the organisms are in the same trophic level, in this case, they're all trees, then this is what's going to happen in the neutral theory. But if you move to a different habitat, like you go into a swamp where you have clearly really different requirements for survival, like roots that are underwater, you're going to have a different composition. And so I think you can bring these two things together to say that perhaps within each age class, you might have neutral theory taking over and ecological drift. But between really clear differences in habitat type, you may have different forest compositions. So that's how I would reconcile them. And well, I recommend you do the same. So niche partitioning seems to be an important thing supported by Terborg's work, and that was really nice. I have some other things in here about spatial distributions that aren't terribly helpful. Basically, this is talking about aggregated trees, or a definition or a support of the idea that recruitment limitation is important. There are some other hypotheses detailed in your text. I'll go through them briefly. The disturbance hypothesis, intermediate disturbance hypothesis, suggests that if a forest habitat reaches climax and stays there, then it tends to have less diversity than if it has a variety of successional stages leading up to that. So if we disturb it at an intermediate level, it will have a higher species richness or diversity because it includes both pioneer species and climax species. Treefall gaps may be maintaining this intermediate level of disturbance. More images of that. And my favorite, and you can watch a couple of videos on agoutis, this is the Jansen-Connell model that is a model for seed dispersal that explains diversity. And essentially in this model, you're going to look at seedling. This is seeds. This is the parent tree, and this is the abundance of seedlings, right? Of seeds. So most seeds fall close to the parent, and then the probability of finding a seed declines as you get further from a parent. Now, if this were the way seeds were distributed and they grew, you would find always seeds growing under the parent, right? But there's problems growing under the parent. And one of the problems is that you have maternal competition from mom. She's in the same niche and she's bigger. She will outcompete you. Plus, you have thousands of siblings, sibling competition. That's not good either. And so with that problem, you've got, how are you going to survive one out of thousands of those different siblings? Very difficult. So it's not so good to survive underneath the parent. As a result, you see really low survivorship of seeds underneath the parent. And then as you move further away, the likelihood of survival increases. But that survival is not only due to maternal and sibling effects. According to Jansen and Connell, it's due to the behavior of predators. Now, a seed predator in this case is an agouti, and you can watch the video. Oops, there's a picture. There's an agouti. This is an agouti. It's a rodent. It can actually gnaw through seeds, eats them, and kills them. Of course, most of them it doesn't kill because it hides them and stashes them in somewhere. And then eventually, if something happens to that agouti, like a jaguar eats it, then that agouti will not recover those seeds, and those seeds will grow, just like the jays that disperse the pinyon pines here at home. Now, what you would find for an agouti is if you're looking for seeds, you're wandering through the forest, it's not really a random look. You're looking around for seeds. And then you find a tree that has a bunch of seeds that have fallen. So what do? You spend the next week harvesting seeds right there. So you look intensively because you know it's a good spot to find them. And all the other seed collectors do the same thing. Because of that, there is a high intensity of searching under parent trees. You're much more likely to survive if you're far from the parent tree because they're not looking for you out there. And since they're not finding many out there, they don't search very intensely when they are out there. So that creates this model where recruitment, that is the young, actually are an intermediate distance from the parent tree, because this is the joint probability of both being there and surviving there. And that would then predict a distribution of trees that is not clumped, but is instead spread very widely across the landscape. How about that? I think that's pretty cool. I love this thing. You really got to look at this one. And check out the videos on the agoutis. And this actually culminates, I know I hate to say it, this is 3 class periods that I have spent on this. 3 class periods. Partly that's because I I spent a lot of time drawing out the neutral theory and kind of elaborating on the story in class. So if you're watching this, read the text about unified neutral theory section, the diversity hypothesis for trees, and be glad that you don't have 3 hours of lecture on this topic. But this pretty much like that was it.